People should know how to hunt. That's an ancient thing that goes back to the earliest humanity.
There's something unsettling about places that look peaceful on the surface, but hide stories no one was ever meant to uncover. Turtle Island was always seen as a quiet sanctuary, a patch of wild land where Eustace Conway lived out the life he preached. Simple, rugged, and honest. But the moment whispers started spreading about a discovery beneath that very soil, the entire narrative around him began to twist into something far stranger. And the eerie part? Those whispers didn't begin when the tunnels were found. They'd been floating around for years. People who live near the property used to joke about how the ground there felt alive, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. Some said they would hear faint vibrations late at night, like something metallic moving underground. Others insisted they had seen thin slits in the dirt, barely wide enough to notice, almost like air vents that didn't belong to any natural formation. Nothing was ever proved, but the rumors stayed alive because they were too strange to ignore, especially considering Eustace's reputation for going against the grain in everything he did. And the more those odd stories circulated, the more people began thinking that maybe Turtle Island wasn't just his personal retreat. Maybe it was something he was constantly building, shaping, and protecting. Some folks even went as far as saying he'd been making preparations for something he never talked about out loud. But of course, that was just talk. Until the day a storm rolled through the mountains and ripped a portion of the hillside open, leaving behind a wound in the earth that didn't look natural at all. This is where the whole situation took a sharp turn. Instead of the simple image people had of Eustace, this free-spirited mountain man living in harmony with nature, there was suddenly the possibility that he was hiding something far more complicated. Something that didn't match the public persona millions believed in. And once explorers started venturing into that exposed opening, what they found didn't just add questions, it multiplied them. But before we dive into what was discovered deep underground, it's important to understand that these odd clues weren't isolated incidents. They formed a pattern. And patterns don't start by accident. If anything, they suggest that something was happening beneath Turtle Island long before the first set of footprints ever touched that hidden entrance. Whether it was intentional planning, decades of secret construction, or something older that Eustace stumbled across, nobody could say for sure. But what everyone agrees on is that it didn't feel like the beginning of a mystery. It felt like the middle of one. And that's where everything truly begins. Because once the hillside cracked open and that first sliver of the tunnel system revealed itself, people realized the rumors weren't exaggerations. If anything, they didn't even come close. What happened next didn't just challenge the image of Turtle Island. It made people question how much of Eustace's story the world had misunderstood all along. And the first clues didn't come from the tunnels themselves, but from the strange signs leading up to their discovery. The storm may have revealed the opening, but the clues leading to it had been scattered around Turtle Island long before the earth gave way. The first thing locals remembered after the discovery was the unusual shifting in the soil. Hikers reported paths subtly warping over the years, not dramatically enough to alarm anyone, but just enough to feel like the ground was settling around something it was hiding. And the more people talked, the more memories resurfaced about moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt disturbingly purposeful. One story that kept resurfacing came from a pair of older hikers who frequently wandered the back ridges near the property. They recalled spotting a narrow depression one summer, almost perfectly straight, running along the woods like a faded scar. They assumed it was where an old log had once rested, But the detail that stuck with them was how cool the air felt when they stepped directly above it, as if something underneath was pulling air downward. Back then, they chalked it up to imagination. After the tunnels were revealed, though, that memory didn't feel so harmless. Others remembered hearing dull, rhythmic knocking at random hours. Never loud, never close, but steady enough to stand out from the usual sounds of the forest. A few claimed the noise started years ago, describing it like someone was working beneath the ground. Of course, nobody took that seriously at the time. After all, who in their right mind would be carving out secret spaces under acres of untouched land? But with hindsight, the pieces started fitting together in ways nobody expected. Then there were the odd vents, thin vertical slits in the dirt or between tree roots, so subtle that most people ignored them. But those who paid attention noticed something strange. During the colder months, faint wisps of warm air rose from them. Not hot, not enough to alarm anyone, but definitely warmer than the surrounding ground. That kind of airflow doesn't come from natural formations. And yet, nobody knew what to make of it. What truly pushed people into curiosity, however, was a seasonal landslide that happened a full year before the big storm. A section of hillside had shifted, just enough to expose what looked like a flattened stone panel buried beneath years of soil. The panel didn't look like part of a foundation or an old structure. It looked deliberately placed. Thick, smooth, and clearly crafted by someone. But the event passed quietly because the panel was quickly covered again by mud and leaves after a second storm rolled through. People forgot about it. Until they couldn't. Looking back now, all these clues feel like warning signs, signals that something bigger was happening under Turtle Island, something meticulous, deliberate, and hidden in plain sight. None of these oddities seemed connected at the time, but taken together, they created a trail that led straight to the moment explorers stumbled across the opening that changed everything. And what they found once they stepped beyond that threshold was nothing like the simple underground shelter people imagined. The real revelation came in the first chamber they stepped into, where the air felt older than the land above it, and the walls carried marks that didn't match anything Eustace was known for. By the time explorers finally reached the exposed spot on the hillside, the stories people had been sharing suddenly felt a lot less like wild speculation and a lot more like clues they should have taken seriously. The ground still carried the scent of fresh soil where the storm had ripped it open, and right in the center of that ragged wound lay an outline that didn't resemble any natural formation. The panel the hikers mentioned years earlier, once buried, forgotten, and dismissed, was now fully visible. And this time, no rushing storm came to cover it back up. What struck the group immediately wasn't the panel itself, but the craftsmanship. It wasn't metal or wood. It looked like a weathered mix of stone and clay pressed into a perfectly rectangular shape, reinforced with fibers that nobody recognized at first glance. The edges were too precise to be accidental. It was as if whoever built it didn't want the entrance to stand out, but also didn't want it to crumble with time. A strange balance between concealment and permanence. When they brushed away the remaining dirt, their hands uncovered a narrow seam running across the top. That seam was the only sign that this wasn't just some odd geological anomaly. And with a little pressure, the panel shifted. Not dramatically, not like a trapdoor swinging open, but subtly, as though it had been waiting decades for someone to touch it again. The sound it made was low and hollow, the kind of echo that immediately tells you there's a void beneath your feet. The moment it moved, cool air drifted up from below, carrying a faint scent of old timber, damp earth, and something slightly metallic. It wasn't the smell of decay or neglect. It was the smell of space. Space that had been sealed off from the world above for a very long time. The panel lifted just enough to reveal a narrow passage, sloping downward at a sharp angle. There was no modern latch, no hinges, nothing that suggested recent additions. Everything about it felt old, but not ancient, like something that had been actively maintained decades ago, then left to sleep. This is where earlier rumors of vents and strange airflow suddenly clicked. The passage wasn't random. It was built with a system in mind, one that circulated air through the soil in ways that were subtle enough for most people to overlook. And if that part made sense, then it meant the rest of the stories, the depressions, the knocking, the shifting paths, weren't stories at all. They were signs of the structure beneath. The explorers weren't sure what they were stepping into. The entrance didn't match anything known about Eustace's typical building style. He was a man who crafted with raw wood, stone, and traditional techniques. But nothing in his public persona hinted at underground architecture. This opening felt different. It felt intentional, engineered, almost methodical. And that was what made it so unnerving. Because if this wasn't built in the style Eustace was famous for, then what exactly was it? And why hide it so carefully that even those closest to him had no idea it existed? Still, curiosity pushed the group forward. With flashlights in hand and careful steps, they descended into the narrow corridor, unaware that what they were about to see in the first chamber would raise more questions than answers. The moment they set foot inside the passage, the world outside disappeared. The light from the opening faded behind them, swallowed by the downward slope, and for a moment, all they could hear was the soft hum of their own breathing bouncing off the walls. The corridor wasn't tall, just enough for someone to walk comfortably if they stayed slightly lowered. But it was the walls themselves that immediately caught their attention. Instead of rough dirt or exposed roots, the inner surface was surprisingly smooth, lined with tightly packed clay, reinforced by wooden ribs. The craftsmanship wasn't crude. It was deliberate, shaped the earth with an understanding of structure and longevity, not just survival. And that was the first sign that this wasn't a simple dugout shelter. The engineering had intent behind it. As they continued downward, the air began to change. It carried a faint herbal scent, something earthy and medicinal. And when they reached the first chamber, that smell made sense. The room wasn't large, but it was organized in a way that suggested purpose. Along one wall sat wooden shelves carved directly into the packed earth. On them rested jars sealed with wax, filled with dried plants, roots, and powders. Most were labeled with markings that didn't match any modern system. The symbols looked like personal shorthand, enigmatic strokes and loops that only the creator could decipher. But the chamber held more than herbs. Tools lay carefully arranged on a flat stone surface. Hand-carved blades, smooth stones, wooden implements, and rolls of thin parchment-like material. None of them looked abandoned. They looked stored, as if someone left them with the intention of returning. And that detail alone made everyone pause. The group began noticing details that didn't align with Eustace's known lifestyle. He was always vocal about living above ground, embracing sunlight, and staying connected to nature. But this chamber felt like the work of someone preparing for long periods underground. Someone who planned for sustainability in a place where daylight didn't reach. Carvings along the far wall added another layer of mystery. They weren't religious symbols or decorative sketches. They resembled maps, crude but specific. Lines curved and intersected, leading to unknown points marked by circles or triangles. Some looked like they represented terrain. Others seemed symbolic, more like coded pathways or ideas. Experts later argued over their meaning. With whatever the truth was, it became obvious the chamber was only the beginning. A narrow tunnel branched off from it, extending deeper into the earth. And this second passage looked far more refined, with wooden beams forming a supportive arch that was clearly designed to handle weight from above. Before moving forward, the explorers exchanged glances. They knew they were stepping into something bigger than a hidden room. The first chamber felt like a workshop, a preparation zone. If this much effort went into the entrance and the workroom, then what lay ahead had to be even more significant. And as they continued deeper, the layout shifted again, transitioning from compact, practical spaces into something far more expansive. What waited in the next section would completely reshape their understanding of the tunnel's purpose, and of Eustace himself. The discovery of the river exit should have marked the end of the exploration. It felt like a natural conclusion. A man building his own pathway to freedom, hidden beneath the land he cherished. But the tunnels were not finished revealing themselves. Several days later, driven by unanswered questions and uneasy curiosity, the team returned with updated equipment and a renewed determination to understand the full scope of Eustace Conway's subterranean world. Their focus shifted to the narrow side passages, thin corridors branching from the main chambers, many partially collapsed or shrouded in debris. One passage in particular drew their attention. It had been sealed by thick layers of fallen timber and rock, its entrance nearly swallowed by earth. It looked less like natural collapse and more like something intentionally buried. It took hours of careful clearing to make the opening large enough to crawl through. The air that flowed out carried a chill distinctly different from the rest of the tunnels. Colder, heavier, as though it had been locked away from the world for decades. When the explorers squeezed through, their lights revealed a small chamber that felt untouched by time. This was the room they would later call the Forbidden Room. The walls were smoother than the earlier hand-dug tunnels, but lacked the industrial rigidity of the concrete chamber. It was a hybrid, part natural cavern, part crafted space. Shelves lined the far wall, holding wax-sealed jars filled with herbs, oils, and substances they couldn't immediately identify. Many were labeled in Eustace's handwriting, though the script looked older, shakier, as though written during the later stages of his secluded work. A wooden table stood against the stone wall, covered with folded maps, handmade tools, and leather-bound books. Dust lay thick across everything, but the arrangement had a precision that felt deliberate. Nothing was scattered. Nothing was left casually placed. Every object had a role. Near the center of the room stood a stone pedestal encircled by melted candles. The wax had pooled so extensively that it had formed hardened ridges across the floor. Whatever happened here wasn't momentary. It was repeated, ritualistic, intentional. But the object resting atop the pedestal silenced the entire group. It was a small chest, bound with rope and wrapped in aging animal hide. The material was dry, almost brittle, as though it hadn't been touched in years. The chest had markings carved lightly into the lid, symbols matching the root-like designs found in the shrine. When one explorer gently unwrapped the hide, the chest gave a faint creak, the sound echoing through the silent chamber like a whisper. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Some were written by Eustace, others appeared addressed to him. The content hinted at communication with people who shared similar off-grid ideologies. Some letters referenced gatherings deep in the Appalachians, meetings held with those who still hear the earth, and discussions of building sanctuaries hidden from the sky. Rumors had circulated for years about alternative communities and freedom networks throughout the mountains, but these letters suggested something more organized, something coordinated. One journal entry stood out. When the noise above becomes too loud, the truth below must be preserved. The mountain remembers what the world forgets. The meaning was unclear, but the implication was chilling. It hinted at more tunnels, more hideaways, perhaps even other groups constructing similar sanctuaries. But the final page in the journal was the one that changed everything. It contained a set of coordinates, etched deeply, almost carved with desperate force. When plotted, they pointed not to Turtle Island, but to another remote section of the Appalachian foothills miles away. A second network? A continuation of the message? Or something meant to stay hidden forever? The explorers exchanged silent glances, understanding that the tunnels they had uncovered weren't the end. They were the beginning of a map, one that stretched far beyond Eustace's land, following routes that dove into the heart of the mountains themselves. And as they stood in the forbidden room, surrounded by relics of a vision carved beneath the world, they finally understood. Eustace hadn't been creating tunnels. He had been creating a legacy, one built in the shadows beneath the earth, designed for a truth the surface wasn't ready to hold.